I'm Linda, 34 years old, and last week at my parents' anniversary dinner, my sister looked me dead in the eye with this cold, casual cruelty that I've seen 1,000 times before but never quite like this, and she said, "We didn't order for your son," while her own children sat there stuffing their faces with $120 steaks like it was nothing. Like my child wasn't even worthy of a place at the table. And when I looked to my father for support, for even just a flicker of fairness, he actually had the audacity to tell me that I should have packed my son something from home, as if we were attending some casual picnic instead of a fancy anniversary dinner that I had actually paid to book in the first place. I smiled through the burning humiliation that was rising in my throat like bile, nodded like the good, compliant daughter I've always been trained to be, and said just one word: noted. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly anticipated in that moment of their comfortable cruelty, was what was coming next. And before I tell you exactly how that night ended and how I finally stood up for myself and my son after years of being treated like we were somehow less than, I want you to hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I need to know I'm not alone in this, that there are other people out there who understand what it's like to be the forgotten one in a family that's supposed to love you unconditionally. Let me take you back so you can understand how we even got to that moment. Because this wasn't just about one dinner or one cruel comment. This was about an entire lifetime of being second best, kind of watching my sister Jill get everything handed to her on a silver platter while I worked my fingers to the bone just to get a fraction of the attention and approval that she received simply for existing. My sister has always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong even when she was doing everything wrong, the one who got bailed out of every single mess she created while I was expected to be the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who cleaned up after everyone else's chaos without complaint or recognition. When we were growing up, Jill got the biggest bedroom, the newest clothes, the expensive dance lessons and art classes, and whatever hobby she decided she was interested in that particular week, while I wore hand-me-downs that didn't even come from her because my parents said I was harder on clothes, and I got books from the library instead of toys because I was more academic anyway, and Blaine didn't need the same things. When she crashed my mom's car when she was 17, they bought her a new one for her 18th birthday because she felt so bad about the accident and needed something to lift her spirits. But when I graduated high school with honors and got accepted to college, I was told that I should be grateful for the opportunity to take out student loans because it would teach me responsibility and the value of money. The pattern continued into adulthood in ways that became even more insidious because now there was money involved, real money, and real responsibilities that somehow always fell on my shoulders, while Jill floated through life like a dandelion seed on the wind, landing wherever was most comfortable and never worried about the consequences. I became the one they called when Jill couldn't make rent because she'd spent her paycheck on a weekend trip with her friends, the one who was expected to help family by sending money, or paying bills, or covering expenses because you're so good with money, Linda. And your sister is still figuring things out, even though she's only 2 years younger than me and has 2 children of her own who she can barely take care of. I've lost count of how many times I've babysat her kids at the last minute because she forgot she had plans or decided she needed a mental health day at the spa. How many times I've lent her money that was never paid back. How many times I've listened to my mother make excuses for her while simultaneously criticizing every single choice I make. From my career, to my parenting, to the way I wear my hair, as if nothing I do will ever be quite good enough to earn the unconditional acceptance that Jill receives without even trying. My parents created this dynamic, and they've maintained it with an iron grip disguised as family loyalty. Because in our family, if Jill stumbled, we all had to fall with her. That was the unspoken rule that governed every interaction and every crisis. And God forbid you suggest that maybe, just maybe, she should face the consequences of her own actions like an adult, because then you were being cruel or unsupportive or jealous of your sister. I remember once, about 3 years ago, when Jill had racked up significant credit card debt buying things she absolutely didn't need. Designer handbags and expensive dinners out and a whole new wardrobe for a job she quit after 2 weeks. and my parents called a family meeting, which really meant a meeting where everyone pressured me to help pay off her debt because I had a stable job and savings, and wasn't supporting anyone but myself at the Wenton drum time, as if my financial stability was somehow a resource that belonged to the entire family rather than the result of my own hard work and sacrifice. I was so angry during that meeting that my hands were shaking, but I kept my voice calm and tried to explain that enabling Jill wasn't helping her, that she needed to learn to manage her own finances, and my father actually said to me, "When did you become so selfish, Linda? This is your sister. Family helps family." And the worst part was that I ended up giving them the money anyway because the guilt was so overwhelming and so deeply ingrained that I couldn't stand the weight of it, couldn't stand being painted as the villain when I was the only one trying to introduce any sense of reality into the situation. So that's the context you need to understand. That's the foundation of resentment and hurt and exhaustion that I was carrying when we all gathered for my parents' 35th wedding anniversary dinner, an occasion that I actually organized because, of course I did, because I'm the responsible one who thinks ahead and makes reservations and coordinates schedules and tries to create nice moments for this family that barely acknowledges my existence except when they need something from me. I spent weeks planning this dinner, researching restaurants and reading reviews because I wanted it to be special, somewhere nice enough to mark the occasion, but not so expensive that my father would complain about the cost, the entire evening, which is a very narrow target to hit with him, and I finally settled on this upscale steakhouse downtown that had excellent ratings and a sophisticated but warm atmosphere, the kind of place with dim lighting and leather booths and white tablecloths that make you feel like you're somewhere important. I made the reservation for 7 people, myself and my son, my parents, Jill and her husband, and their 2 kids, and I specifically told them when I sent the invitation that I was treating everyone to celebrate this milestone, that it was my gift to my parents, and everyone enthusiastically agreed and thanked me, and said how thoughtful I was. And for a brief, naive moment, I thought maybe this would be a good evening. Maybe this would be one of those memories we'd all look back on fondly. I should have known better. I really should have. Because nothing with my family ever goes the way I hope it will. And the warning sign started before we even got to the restaurant, when Jill texted me saying she and her family were going to arrive early because the kids are hungry and you know how they get, which should have told me, right then, that she was already planning to take control of the evening. I had organized, but I was still in that optimistic mindset, still trying to believe the best. My son and I arrived exactly on time, which is how I always am because punctuality was drilled into me as a virtue even though it's apparently optional for everyone else in my family, and when we walked into the restaurant, I immediately saw Jill and her crew already seated at our table, already looking comfortable and settled like they owned the place, seeing her kids loud and energetic in that way that makes other diners glance over with barely concealed annoyance. Her husband Steve already sipping what looked like an expensive cocktail, and Jill herself draped across the booth like she was posing for a magazine spread. My parents weren't there yet, which meant Jill had arrived even earlier than her text suggested, early enough to clearly have already ordered drinks and appetizers based on the plates I could see on the table, and when I approached with my son beside me, holding my hand because he's a shy kid and big social gatherings make him nervous, Jill looked up with this smile that didn't reach her eyes and said hello in that tone she uses when she's performing sisterly affection for an audience. My son was actually excited to be there, which breaks my heart even more when I think about what happened next, because he'd put on his nice button-up shirt and combed his hair without me even asking. And on the drive over, he'd been asking me questions about what kind of food they'd have and whether he could try something new. And I'd told him he could order anything he wanted because this was a special occasion and we were celebrating as a family. He's 9 years old, this sweet, sensitive kid who reads books above his grade level and draws elaborate pictures of dragons and spaceships, who's being raised by just me because his father decided parenthood wasn't for him and left when my son was barely 2, and I have worked so incredibly hard to give him a good life, to make sure he feels loved and valued and important even though I'm doing it alone without the support system that Jill has with her husband and our parents constantly available to babysit and help out and provide whatever she needs. I don't get that help. I never have, because apparently my choice to leave my ex means I made my bed and now I have to lie in it, according to my mother's thinly veiled comments over the years. And the fact that my ex was emotionally abusive and manipulative doesn't seem to factor into her judgment of the situation at all. So we sat down at the table, my son and I, sliding into the booth across from Jill's family. And I was making small talk and asking her kids about school and complimenting my brother-in-law on something I don't even remember because I was on autopilot, performing the role of pleasant family member while we waited for my parents to arrive. They showed up about 10 minutes later, my mother in a dress I'd never seen before that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, my father in a suit and tie looking distinguished and proud, and there was this whole production of greetings and hugs and the kids presenting handmade cards they'd made, though I noticed that the card from Jill's kids was clearly something Jill had made because the handwriting was too perfect and the sentiment too mature, while my son had actually made his card himself with markers and stickers and his own 9-year-old handwriting that spelled anniversary wrong but was genuine and from his heart. My mother cooed over both cards equally, but I saw how she displayed Jill's card more prominently, angling it so the other diners could see it, and it was such a small thing, but it added to the pile of small things that had been accumulating my entire life, brick by brick building this wall of resentment that I kept trying to pretend wasn't there. The waiter came by once everyone was settled, a young guy probably in his mid-20s who was professional and attentive, and he started taking drink orders and explaining the specials. And this is when everything started to go wrong, when the evening tipped from uncomfortable into absolutely humiliating in a way that I'm still processing even now, even after what I did in response. Jill immediately started ordering for her kids without even looking at the menu, rattling off these expensive entrees like it was nothing, the ribeye for her oldest and the filet mignon for her youngest, who's literally 6 years old and probably can't even tell the difference between a $50 steak and chicken nuggets. And her husband ordered the porterhouse and Jill got the surf and turf. And my parents ordered their meals and I ordered mine. And then the waiter turned to my son with this friendly smile and started to ask what he'd like. And that's when Jill interrupted, just cut right across the conversation with that casual cruelty I mentioned, and said, "Oh, we didn't order for him," gesturing at my son like he was an afterthought, like he was somehow not part of the family gathering, like his presence was optional and his hunger irrelevant. The confusion on the waiter's face mirrored exactly what I was feeling, this moment of cognitive dissonance where surely I must have misheard. Surely she didn't just say what I think she said, but then my father, my own father who's supposed to protect and care about his grandson, actually backed her up by saying to me, not even to the waiter but to me directly, "You should have packed him something if you knew he'd be hungry." Linda, this is an expensive place, and I felt like I'd been slapped, like the air had been sucked out of the room. And I looked around the table expecting someone to object, expecting my mother to say something, or Steve to look uncomfortable, or literally anyone to acknowledge how absolutely insane and cruel this was. But everyone just sat there, either looking at their menus or their phones, or anywhere except at me and my son, complicit in their silence. And when I glanced down at my boy, I saw his face. I saw the exact moment that the excitement and happiness drained out of his eyes and was replaced with confusion and hurt, and this terrible understanding that he was being excluded, that he was being told he didn't matter, so that he wasn't as important as his cousins, who were already chattering about their steaks and sides while he sat there with nothing. I have never in my entire life felt rage like what I felt in that moment. This white-hot fury that started in my chest and spread through my entire body like I'd been set on fire from the inside, and it was mixed with this profound grief and this crushing sense of failure because I had brought my child here thinking we were going to have a nice family dinner, thinking that surely for one evening we could all just be normal and kind to each other, and instead I had walked him directly into a situation where he was being publicly humiliated and excluded, and it was my fault for not protecting him, for not anticipating that my family would find a way to make even this about their hierarchy of who matters and who doesn't. But here's the thing about that rage. Here's what was different about it compared to all the other times I've swallowed my anger and my hurt and just accepted whatever my family dished out. In that moment, something crystallized for me. Something shifted deep in my consciousness. And I realized with perfect clarity that they weren't going to change, that no amount of hoping or trying or being the bigger person was ever going to make them see me or my son as worthy of basic human respect and consideration, that I had been beating my head against a wall for 34 years, expecting different results from the same toxic patterns, and that the only thing I could actually control was my own response, my own choices, and my own willingness to continue participating in this dynamic. So I did something I had never done before in my entire life, of managing my family's egos and smoothing over conflicts and making myself small so everyone else could be comfortable. I decided in that split second that I was done, that I wasn't going to smile and nod and accept this anymore. Is that if they wanted to play games about who deserved what, then I was going to flip the entire board over and walk away from the table. I took a breath, and I could feel my son's hand gripping mine under the table, and I squeezed it back to let him know that I had him, that I was going to make this right. And then I turned to the waiter with the calmest voice I could manage, even though inside I was screaming, and I said, "Excuse me, I need to make some changes to our order." And he looked relieved to have something to do, some way to cut through the awkward tension that was now hanging over the table like a fog. And he said, "Of course, ma'am, what would you like to change?" And I said, very clearly so that everyone at the table could hear me, "I need you to cancel all the orders that were just placed, all of them, every single entree and appetizer and drink that hasn't been prepared yet." And you could have heard a pin drop. The entire table went silent. Jill's mouth literally fell open. My father's face started turning that particular shade of red. That means he's about to lose his temper. And my mother made this little gasping sound like I'd just announced I was joining a cult. But I wasn't done, not even close, because the waiter was looking at me with confusion and asking, "All of them, ma'am? Are you sure?" And I said, "Yes, absolutely all of them, and anything that's already been prepared or in progress. I want you to put that on my father's bill because this is his anniversary after all, and I'm sure he'd be happy to cover it as the patriarch of the family." And I saw my father's face go from red to almost purple, and Jill started to sputter something, but I just kept going, turning to the waiter and saying, "And for my son, the young man right here, who was apparently not important enough to be included in the family dinner, I'd like him to have the ribeye, medium rare, with the truffle mac and cheese as a side, and the loaded baked potato, and a Shirley Temple to drink, and whatever dessert he wants later. And all of that will be on my tab, my separate tab that you're going to open for just the two of us." And the waiter was trying so hard not to smile. I could see the corners of his mouth twitching. And he said, "Absolutely. I'll get that taken care of right away." And he practically fled from the table to avoid the explosion he could sense was coming. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that exists right before a bomb goes off, where everything is suspended in this moment of anticipation and disbelief. And I could see everyone processing what had just happened, trying to figure out if I was serious, if I had actually just done what they thought I'd done. And then my father found his voice and he started in on me with this tone he uses when he's trying to assert dominance, this cold, controlled anger that's somehow worse than yelling. And he said, "Linda, what exactly do you think you're doing? This is completely inappropriate and embarrassing." And I looked him right in the eye, this man who had just told me I should have packed food for my child like we were attending a potluck instead of a dinner I had organized and was paying for, and I said, "What's inappropriate is excluding a 9-year-old child from a family dinner because apparently some members of this family are more valuable than others. What's inappropriate is me spending weeks organizing this celebration and making a reservation and offering to treat everyone, only to have my son treated like he's not worthy of a meal. What's inappropriate is the way this family has operated for my entire life, and I'm done with it. I'm completely done pretending any of this is normal or acceptable." Jill jumped in then, because of course she did, using that wounded voice she always uses when she's being called out for her behavior, saying, "Oh my God, Linda, you're being so dramatic. We just didn't think you'd want to spend that much money on a kid's meal when he probably won't even eat it all. We were trying to help you save money, and the gaslighting was so blatant, so obvious that I actually laughed, this harsh sound that didn't sound like my normal laugh at all, and I said, "Really, Jill? You were concerned about my finances?" That's interesting coming from someone who I've bailed out financially more times than I can count. Someone who's never paid me back a single dollar. There's someone whose rent I've covered and whose credit card debt I've helped with, and whose kids I babysit for free whenever you decide you need a break. But sure, you were worried about me spending money on my own son at a dinner I planned and was paying for anyway. That makes perfect sense. My mother tried to intervene then, using her peacemaker voice that's really just code for, "Linda, stop making trouble and go back to your role as the compliant one." And she said, "Let's all just calm down and enjoy the evening. There's no need for this kind of scene in public," and I realized that was what bothered her most. Not that her grandson had been excluded and humiliated, but that I was making a scene, that I was disrupting the careful facade of family harmony that she'd spent years constructing. One of my uncles was at a nearby table, Uncle Gary, my dad's younger brother, who's always been the black sheep of that side of the family because he had the audacity to divorce his first wife and marry someone he actually loved, and I saw him trying to hide a smile behind his napkin. And later he would text me saying that watching me stand up to my father was the highlight of his year. But in the moment, all I could focus on was getting through this dinner and getting my son out of there with his dignity intact. The waiter came back remarkably quickly with my son's Shirley Temple, probably because he could sense the tension and wanted to fulfill at least one order before the whole table imploded, and my son took it with a quiet thank you that nearly broke my heart because he's such a good kid, such a kind and polite kid who deserves so much better than this. And I told him that his food would be out soon and that we could leave right after he ate if he wanted, and he just nodded, looking down at his drink. And I knew he was trying not to cry, trying to be brave, and the fact that my family had put him in this position made me want to scream. The rest of the table sat there in this excruciating awkwardness. I'm not sure what to do now that their meals had been canceled and the evening had been thoroughly derailed, and my father was having a hushed but intense argument with my mother, and Jill was texting furiously on her phone, probably rallying her friends to validate her victim narrative, and her husband Steve was staring at the wall like he wished he could teleport to literally anywhere else, and her kids were whining about being hungry, and I just sat there with my arm around my son, waiting for his food and counting down the minutes until we could leave. When the waiter brought out my son's ribeye, perfectly cooked and beautifully presented with the truffle mac and cheese that looked like something from a food magazine, I saw my son's eyes get wide, and the waiter, bless him, made a little flourish of presenting it and said, "For the young gentleman," treating my son with the respect and attention that his own family hadn't shown him. And I tipped that waiter 40% when we left because he didn't have to do that, didn't have to make that extra effort. But he saw a kid who needed to feel special, and he delivered. My son ate his dinner slowly, savoring it, and I ordered something small for myself, just so he wouldn't feel awkward eating alone, and we didn't speak much. I just sat there in our little bubble while the rest of the table continued to spiral around us, and when my father tried to engage me again, tried to start another lecture about my behavior, I just held up my hand and said, "I'm done with this conversation. We're going to finish our meal and then we're leaving. And you all can figure out your own dinner situation." And he was so shocked that I dismissed him like that, so utterly stunned that I wasn't falling into line, that he actually stopped talking, and my mother looked like she might cry, but not because she felt bad about what had happened, but because her carefully planned image of family unity was crumbling and she couldn't control the narrative. We left before they did, my son and I walking out of that restaurant with our heads held high, even though I was shaking with adrenaline and residual anger, and I could feel their eyes on us as we went. I could feel the weight of their judgment and shock. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care. I genuinely did not care what they thought because I had finally chosen my son over their approval. Had finally drawn a line and said this far and no further. The drive home was quiet, my son staring out the window, and I asked him if he was okay, and he said, "I don't think they like us very much, do they, Mom?" And I had to pull over because I was crying too hard to drive safely. And I told him that it wasn't about him, that he was perfect and wonderful and deserved the world, and that sometimes families don't treat each other the way they should. But that didn't mean there was anything wrong with him. It meant there was something wrong with them. And he hugged me and said, "It's okay, Mom, I still had a good steak." And he was trying to make me feel better. This 9-year-old child was trying to comfort me. And it solidified everything I'd decided in that restaurant. The aftermath started that same night. Before we'd even gotten home, there were already texts coming through, my phone buzzing continuously with messages that ranged from angry to manipulative to outright cruel. And I didn't read most of them until later, but the preview notifications were enough to get the gist. My sister sent a long message about how I'd ruined our parents' anniversary and embarrassed the whole family, and how could I be so selfish and hateful, conveniently forgetting that she was the one who'd started this whole thing by excluding my son. And my mother sent several messages, saying I needed to apologize immediately and that my behavior was unacceptable and that I'd always been a difficult child, but this was beyond the pale, which was particularly rich coming from someone who'd sat there silently while her grandson was humiliated. My father left a voicemail that I did listen to eventually, and it was him at his most patriarchal and condescending, explaining to me like I was a child that there are certain standards of behavior expected in this family and that I had violated them, and that until I was ready to apologize and make amends, I shouldn't bother coming to any family functions, as if that was some kind of punishment instead of exactly what I wanted at that point. I didn't respond to any of them that night. I just put my son to bed and sat in my living room in the dark, trying to process everything that had happened and everything that I was feeling. And it was this strange mix of vindication and grief because, on one hand, I'd finally stood up for myself and my son. I'd finally said, enough is enough. But on the other hand, I was mourning the family I'd always wanted but never actually had, mourning the fantasy of belonging and acceptance that I'd been chasing my whole life even though it was never real to begin with. I thought about all the times I'd made excuses for them. All the times I'd convinced myself that they loved me even if they didn't show it the way I needed. All the times I'd bent over backwards to accommodate their dysfunction while getting nothing in return except criticism and exploitation. And I realized that I'd been complicit in my own mistreatment by continuing to show up and play my assigned role in their dysfunctional system. The next day was a Saturday, and I'd planned to spend it relaxing with my son, maybe taking him to the park or watching movies, just decompressing from the nightmare of the night before. But my parents had other plans, because around 11 in the morning they showed up at my house unannounced. Just rang the doorbell like they had every right to be there. And when I opened the door, my father was holding a piece of paper and my mother looked like she'd been crying, and my father immediately went on the offensive, shoving this paper at me, and it was a bill from the restaurant for the drinks and appetizers that Jill and her family had ordered before everyone else arrived. The ones that I'd told the waiter to put on my father's tab, and it was about $200, and my father was demanding that I pay it because it was my stunt that had caused this problem. I looked at that bill, and then at my father's red face and my mother's teary eyes, and I felt this incredible sense of clarity. This understanding that this was a pivotal moment where I could either fall back into the old patterns or I could continue down this new path I'd started the night before, and I chose the latter. I chose myself and my son, and I said, "No, I'm not paying that. You all ordered those things before I even arrived, and I made it very clear what happened to those orders. So that's your bill to deal with." And my father started to argue, but I cut him off, which I'd never done before in my life. And I said, "Actually, since you're here, there are some things we need to discuss, so you might as well come in." And they followed me into my living room, probably expecting that I was going to cave, that I was going to apologize and pay the bill and restore the status quo. But I had called Uncle Gary that morning and he talked me through what I needed to say. I had validated everything I was feeling and encouraged me to set real boundaries, and I was ready. I told my son to go play in his room because this was adult conversation. And once he was gone, I turned to my parents and I told them everything. I mean everything. Years and years of accumulated hurt and resentment came pouring out, and I told them about how unequal their treatment of me and Jill had always been. How I'd spent my whole life trying to earn approval that they gave to her freely. How I'd financially supported their golden child again and again while getting no recognition or appreciation. And how I'd provided free babysitting and emotional labor and practical help whenever they needed it, but the one time I needed support, when I was leaving my abusive ex, I'd been made to feel like I was being dramatic and difficult. I told them that I'd spent thousands of dollars over the years bailing Jill out of problems of her own making, and I pulled out my phone and showed them my records, my bank statements and Venmo transactions and text message requests for money, and I asked them if they had any idea how much of my own financial security I'd sacrificed for a sister who'd never once said thank you or paid me back. And they just sat there, stunned, because I think they genuinely never thought about it, had never added it up, or considered the cost to me. I told them that I was done, that I was completely done enabling Jill's irresponsible behavior and accepting their favoritism and pretending that any of this was normal or okay, and that from this point forward I would not be providing any financial support to my sister. I would not be attending family functions where my son and I were treated as lesser than. I would not be accepting criticism or guilt trips or manipulation, and that if they wanted any kind of relationship with me going forward, it would have to be on terms of mutual respect, which meant acknowledging their role in this dysfunction and making real changes, not just apologizing to smooth things over and then going right back to the same patterns. My mother tried the guilt approach, talking about how family is supposed to forgive and how I was being cruel to hold grudges, and I actually laughed, this bitter sound, and I said, I've been forgiving you for 34 years. I've been the one constantly extending grace and understanding and making accommodations, and where has that gotten me? It's gotten me to a place where my child is excluded from a family dinner because he's not important enough, and I'm done. I'm so completely done sacrificing myself and my son on the altar of family peace. My father tried a different approach, the authoritarian one, telling me that I was being disrespectful and that I needed to remember who I was talking to. And that's when I really let loose. That's when years of pent-up anger came flooding out. And I told him that respect is earned, not demanded, and that he'd lost my respect when he told me to pack my son a lunch, like we were going to a picnic instead of standing up for his grandson's inclusion in a family celebration. I told him that his authority over me ended when I became an adult, and that I was no longer a child who could be controlled or manipulated or guilted into compliance, and that if he couldn't treat me as an equal, as a grown woman worthy of consideration, then we didn't have a relationship worth maintaining. I told them both that the favoritism they'd shown Jill our entire lives hadn't helped her. It had actually hurt her by preventing her from developing into a functional adult who could handle her own responsibilities, and that they'd hurt me by making me feel like I was never good enough no matter how hard I tried or how much I achieved, and that I was breaking that cycle. I was stopping it right here with my own son, who would grow up knowing he was valued and loved unconditionally, not based on some arbitrary hierarchy of worthiness. The conversation ended with them leaving angry and me standing in my doorway watching them go, and I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd been carrying around this tremendous weight and had finally set it down. And yes, there was grief there too. Grief for the relationship I'd wanted but would never have. But there was also freedom. Genuine freedom from the constant anxiety of trying to manage their expectations and emotions. In the days that followed, I got more messages from various family members, some supporting me quietly through private texts, like Uncle Gary and a couple of cousins who'd witnessed similar favoritism in their own family branches, and others condemning me for breaking up the family and being dramatic and not knowing how to take a joke, which really revealed who they were and what they valued. Jill sent a particularly nasty message calling me a vindictive bitch and saying I was just jealous that she had a complete family while I was a single mother, which was such a low blow and so completely missing the point that I didn't even dignify it with a response. I just blocked her number because I didn't need that toxicity in my life anymore. What really struck me in the aftermath was how much of my identity had been wrapped up in my role as the family fixer, the responsible one, the one who showed up and helped out and smoothed things over. And now that I'd stepped out of that role, there was this vacuum, this space where that part of me had been, and I had to figure out who I was without it. I started seeing a therapist, which I should have done years ago honestly, and she helped me understand the dynamics I'd been trapped in. The parentification I'd experienced as a child, where I was made responsible for managing adult emotions and problems, the golden child divided by scapegoat dynamic between me and Jill, the enmeshment and lack of boundaries that had characterized our family system. She validated what I'd been feeling, confirmed that yes, this was dysfunctional, no, it wasn't normal, and yes, I had every right to protect myself and my son by stepping away, and hearing that from a professional helped counter all the voices in my head that had been trained by my family to doubt myself and my perceptions. I also started digging into some old family history, talking to extended relatives and asking questions I'd never asked before, trying to understand where this favoritism had come from and why I'd always been treated as less than, and what I discovered was both illuminating and heartbreaking. Apparently, and I'd never known this, my parents had gotten pregnant with me early in their marriage when they weren't ready, when my mother was still in school and my father was just starting his career, and I was apparently a source of stress and difficulty for them during a time when they were trying to establish themselves, whereas Jill had been planned, had come along when they were stable and ready, and she fit into their life in a way that I apparently hadn't. My aunt told me this over coffee one day, thinking I already knew, and she could see the realization dawning on my face, the understanding that I'd been resented from the beginning for disrupting their plans, and that resentment had colored every interaction and every comparison and every instance of favoritism my entire life. This revelation could have destroyed me. Honestly, it could have sent me into a spiral of self-blame and worthlessness. But instead, it had the opposite effect because it confirmed that there was nothing I could have done differently, no amount of achieving or helping or being perfect that would have changed their fundamental resentment of my existence, and that meant I could finally stop trying. I could finally let go of the fantasy that if I just found the right formula, I could make them love me the way they loved Jill. It wasn't about me. It had never been about me. It was about their own issues and limitations and unresolved feelings, and I could spend the rest of my life trying to fix that, or I could accept it and move on. And I chose to move on. I chose to take all that energy I'd been pouring into a black hole of trying to earn their approval and redirect it toward my son and myself, toward building a life that felt good and healthy and whole without needing their validation. About 2 weeks after the dinner incident, I made some practical changes to reinforce my boundaries. I changed the locks on my house because my parents had a key and I didn't want them showing up unannounced anymore. And when my mother called asking why her key didn't work, I told her very calmly that I needed privacy and space and that if she wanted to visit, she could call ahead like any other guest. And she was offended, of course. I acted like I'd committed some terrible betrayal, but I held firm. I also sent a clear email to both Jill and my parents outlining my boundaries, putting in writing that I would no longer be providing financial assistance to Jill, that I would no longer be available for last-minute babysitting, that I would no longer be attending family events where my son and I were not treated with equal respect, and that any relationship going forward would require mutual respect and acknowledgement of past hurts. And if they couldn't agree to those terms, then we would be maintaining distance for the foreseeable future. The responses were about what I expected: anger and defensiveness from Jill, hurt and manipulation from my mother, stony silence from my father, and that was fine. I'd said what I needed to say and the ball was in their court. The interesting thing was how quickly my stress levels dropped once I'd established these boundaries. I didn't realize how much mental and emotional energy I'd been expending on managing my family's dysfunction until I stopped doing it. And suddenly, I had all this bandwidth for other things, for being more present with my son, for investing in friendships that were actually reciprocal and healthy, for pursuing hobbies and interests I'd neglected because I was always on call for family drama. My son noticed the change too. He told me one evening while we were making dinner together that I seemed happier, that I smiled more and didn't seem as worried all the time. And I realized he was right. I was happier, genuinely happier than I'd been in years, maybe ever, because I wasn't constantly bracing for the next crisis or criticism or demand for help. I told him that I'd made some changes in how I dealt with certain people, and that those changes were good for both of us, and he just nodded and said, "Good. Because some of those people weren't very nice to you, Mom." And out of the mouths of babes, right? Even at 9 years old, he could see what I'd been in denial about for so long. I want to be clear that this wasn't easy, that cutting ties with family or even just establishing firm boundaries comes with a cost. There's grief and guilt and this sense of loss even when you know you're doing the right thing. Because we're conditioned to believe that family is everything, that you have to maintain those relationships no matter what. That blood is thicker than water and all those other platitudes that keep people trapped in toxic dynamics. There were nights when I second-guessed myself, when I wondered if I'd been too harsh or if I should have tried one more time to make them understand. But then I'd remember my son's face at that dinner table. The look of hurt and confusion when he realized he was being excluded, and my resolve would strengthen because protecting him from that kind of treatment was worth any amount of discomfort or social pressure. I also had to deal with the judgment from people who didn't understand the full situation. People who would hear that I wasn't speaking to my parents or sister and would make assumptions about me being difficult or unforgiving, not knowing the years of context and pain that had led to this decision, and I had to develop a thicker skin about that, had to accept that not everyone would understand and that was okay because they didn't need to. This wasn't about their approval either. As weeks turned into months, my new normal started to feel less new and just normal. I got used to not having those relationships in my active life, used to not expecting anything from them and therefore not being disappointed, and the space they'd occupied was gradually filled with better things, healthier relationships, more peace. Uncle Gary and I got much closer. He became like a surrogate father to my son, showing up for his school events and taking him to baseball games and being the male role model I'd worried about providing as a single mother. Some cousins reached out privately and we started our own smaller family gatherings, where everyone was included and respected and where there wasn't this constant undercurrent of competition and comparison. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected over the years because I'd been so consumed with family obligations, and I invested in those friendships in a way I hadn't been able to before, actually showing up as a full person rather than as someone perpetually drained by family drama. There was one particularly poignant moment about 3 months after the dinner incident. I was at a park with my son and he was playing on the playground, and I was watching him and feeling this overwhelming sense of contentment, and I realized that I wasn't thinking about my parents or sister, wasn't carrying that constant background anxiety about what they needed or what they thought of me. I was just present in this moment with my child, and it felt like such a gift, such a hard-won victory. Later that day at home, we were having dinner together, just the two of us like we did most nights, and my son looked at me with this serious expression and said, "You seem happier, Mom." And I felt tears spring to my eyes because he was right. I was happier. I had finally chosen us over their dysfunction, had finally prioritized our peace and well-being over maintaining relationships that were fundamentally damaging, and that choice had freed us both. I told him, "I finally am happy, sweetheart, because I figured out that we don't need everyone's approval to be okay. We just need each other and the people who really love us." And he smiled and went back to his dinner, satisfied with that answer. And I sat there feeling this profound sense of rightness, sense of alignment between my values and my actions. The journey to get to that point had been painful and messy and had required me to face some hard truths about my family and myself. But it had been worth it, so incredibly worth it, because I was modeling for my son what it looks like to have boundaries, what it looks like to demand respect, what it looks like to walk away from relationships that diminish you rather than build you up, and those were lessons that would serve him his whole life. I thought about all the years I'd wasted trying to be enough for people who were determined to see me as lacking, all the energy I'd poured into trying to fix a family system that was designed to keep me in a subordinate role, and I felt a combination of grief for that lost time and determination not to waste any more of it. If you've ever stood up to family disrespect, if you've ever had to make the incredibly difficult choice to step back from toxic relationships, even when they're with people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, I want you to know that you're not alone, that what you're feeling is valid, and that choosing yourself and your peace is not selfish, it's necessary, it's survival, it's the foundation of building a healthier life. Tell your story in the comments. Share what you've been through. Because there's power in knowing we're not alone in these struggles. And maybe your story will give someone else the courage to draw their own boundaries and stop accepting treatment that makes them feel less than. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share this with anyone who needs to hear it, because somewhere out there is someone sitting at a family dinner table feeling exactly like I felt, wondering if they're crazy for being hurt, wondering if they should just accept being treated poorly for the sake of keeping the peace. And they need to know that there's another option, that they can stand up, that they can walk away, that they can choose themselves, and that on the other side of that choice is a life with so much more peace and authenticity and joy than they ever thought possible while trapped in those toxic dynamics.